Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for dialing in for today's webinar. My name is Michael Burr. I'm the director of Microgrid Institute, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar on Minnesota's draft CHP Action Plan. Before we get started, a quick acknowledgement and disclaimer. This presentation was prepared for the Minnesota Department of Commerce Division of Energy Resources as part of a project that was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. The disclaimer basically says that whatever we say in this presentation aren't necessarily the views of the Department of Commerce, or for that matter, the U.S. Department of Energy, and any content in this presentation is basically the responsibility of Microgrid Institute, so any errors and omissions would be our responsibility and not DOE's or the Department of Commerce. Today's webinar will focus on the Minnesota CHP Action Plan and also the CHP stakeholder engagement process that led to it. Our agenda will start with some introductions with regard to the people that are presenting today. Then we'll go into a review of the CHP stakeholder engagement process and the outcomes that led to the CHP Action Plan recommendations that the Minnesota Department of Commerce has developed in draft form at this point. Then our colleagues from the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois at Chicago will present on the efforts that the state of Illinois has been making that are pertinent and provide some models for potential adaptation in Minnesota. We'll have time for some questions and answers, and then we'll talk about next steps in the CHP Action Plan. I should mention that the Q&A period will be a text-based Q&A period. So if you want to ask questions, please do so using the GoToWebinar console. Just click on questions and submit your questions that way, and we will get to them during the Q&A period. I should also mention that in this webinar, we'll be addressing general questions about CHP and about the stakeholder engagement process and development of the CHP Action Plan. But detailed content questions should be submitted to Department of Commerce as part of the comment period that is taking place now and that will close on May 15th. So, introducing today's presenters. We have on the phone Jessica Burdette, who's a supervisor in the Minnesota Department of Commerce Division of Energy Resources, focusing on the Conservation Improvement Program, and also Adam Zoet, who is an energy policy planner in the same department, also involved with the Conservation Improvement Program. As I mentioned, my name is Michael Burr with Microgrid Institute. Also with the Energy Resources Center, we have Stefano Galiasso, who is a research engineer, and Graeme Miller, who's a policy analyst. I'll provide a quick introduction of Microgrid Institute. Microgrid Institute is a collaborative organization focusing on issues affecting development of microgrids and other distributed energy systems. We focus on a wide range of issues, mostly affecting development and market development. We are a multidisciplinary organization. We seek to collaborate with a lot of different industry leaders and participants on a variety of different projects. We take an independent and objective approach the projects that we undertake and the initiatives that we lead. You can see here a few of the initiatives that we are involved with. I won't go through all of them, but this information is all also available at our website at microgridinstitute.org. At the end of the presentation, I'll be providing a screen that has links to content about the CHP Action Plan and stakeholder engagement process and about Microgrid Institute as well. So, to introduce CHP, CHP stands for Combined Heat and Power, and it represents the simultaneous generation of electricity and useful thermal energy from a single fuel source. And the difference between that and a typical electric generation system is pictured here in this diagram. In a typical non-CHP power generation system, the entire top cycle generally doesn't exist, and the waste heat from exhaust gases may be vented right into the atmosphere and therefore wasted. So a CHP process seeks to recover as much of that heat as possible and then to make use of it in some thermal process or in a heating or cooling process via absorption chillers. So CHP is already an important resource and technology in the state of Minnesota. There's already installed almost 1,000 megawatts of CHP in Minnesota, which represents about 6% of the total installed electric generating capacity in the state. And that's spread across about 52 sites. Most of the capacity is contained in large systems at chemical facilities and paper mills. CHP brings some interesting value proposition to the market, including, obviously, the ability to save energy by reducing the amount of fuel used to produce the combined outputs of electric and thermal heat that's required by the end-use customer. There is significant potential in Minnesota for CHP deployment. Studies as part of the entire process that the Minnesota Department of Commerce has been engaged with over the last couple of years showed that there's about 3,000 megawatts of technical potential for CHP development in the state. And of that, almost 1,000 megawatts of potential is considered relatively economically attractive with payback periods of less than 10 years. In other words, that these projects could pay for themselves, pay for their investments within or less than 10 years. So the process that we're involved with now with the Department of Commerce is part of an ongoing long-term effort at the state level to try and capture some of the values and benefits of CHP that haven't yet been exploited in the state, or at least to characterize and study what that potential is. So it started when the Minnesota legislature passed House File 729 in early 2013, and that act called for Commerce to perform an energy savings goal study. The Department of Commerce did that in 2014 after conducting stakeholder meetings in late 2013 that included discussions of industrial energy efficiency and combined heat and power. The Energy Savings Goal Study Report in April 2014 included recommendations for continuing CHP evaluation. The Department of Commerce followed up with some studies, including Energy Resource Center's analysis of standby rates and net metering policies and how they might affect the CHP deployment in the state, as well as FVB Energy's analysis of policy factors affecting CHP, as well as the potential for CHP in the state. Following that, the Department of Commerce secured a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy to perform a CHP stakeholder engagement process, which we are engaged in right now, as well as to develop a CHP action plan as a result of the information gathered through that stakeholder engagement process. So you can see on this screen the text that's in green. That refers to the stakeholder engagement process itself, which we will delve into in a bit more detail in some of the following slides. So the purpose of the stakeholder engagement process started with providing information, and the outcome of the stakeholder engagement process was a results synthesized to inform the development of Minnesota's CHP Action Plan. All along the way, though, the process was designed and pursued so that, first of all, we would provide information to get stakeholders up to speed with what the issues are and make sure everyone is effectively on the same page in the discussion. And then following that, we sought to gather input from stakeholders and facilitate dialogue among them, and then to synthesize the results of all that engagement for input into the CHP Action Plan. So that CHP stakeholder engagement process began back in August of last year with a pre-engagement survey that we performed as a contractor for the Department of Commerce at Microgrid Institute. That survey sought to obtain information from stakeholders about their perspectives on CHP and their experience with CHP, as well as their thoughts about the issues and factors that are most important affecting exploitation of future potential for CHP. That was followed with a series of stakeholder meetings that took place at the Wilder Foundation Center in St. Paul, starting in early September and concluding in early November of 2014. In the middle of that series of meetings, a public comment period was convened by the Department of Commerce. We received a large number of very interesting and detailed and helpful comments that were synthesized in a report, and that also served as part of the final recommendations that Microgrid Institute made in its final report on the CHP stakeholder engagement process. Additionally, we performed a post-engagement survey with a final report that compared and contrasted the results of that survey with the pre-engagement survey, and also delved into some of the new information that was revealed as a result of new questions that were added to the survey as a result of the stakeholder engagement process itself. So the report and recommendations from this entire process were then used by the Department of Commerce in development of the CHP Action Plan. So you can see from this next slide the many different ways that we were able to engage stakeholders, allowed stakeholders to identify the priority issues and options that were most important to them, and hopefully all of that input was synthesized in a way that leads to a very effective and practical CHP Action Plan. The CHP Action Plan priorities are summarized here as these top 6 priority issues that the Department of Commerce identified for addressing in the CHP Action Plan, as well as the action items that they recommend out of it, as well as the timing. So we'll delve right into the first priority topic, and that is standby rates. So standby rates basically are required for utilities to provide standby service for customers that have a CHP system that may need to come offline for one reason or another, whether it's an outage associated with that system or whether it's scheduled maintenance or some other reason. So the way that those standby rates are set up and how they apply and how different customers use them was an issue that was identified by stakeholders as being important to the development of economic CHP going forward. Stakeholders pointed out that policies should be fair, for one thing, but also should allow utilities to recover their actual costs of providing standby service. But also they should provide flexibility for customers to self-dispatch their systems, to reduce their load, and to find other alternative resources. And finally, standby rate structures, stakeholders indicated, ought to be transparent and simple to allow them to forecast the actual standby costs that they're going to face. The Department of Commerce suggests in the CHP Action Plan that stakeholders should continue engaging on this topic through a parallel process that's underway now at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. There's a generic proceeding on standby rates underway now. You can see in the green box here the docket for that. You can go to the PUC website and find out more information about that process. So the second priority area identified in the CHP Action Plan and through the stakeholder engagement process involves methodologies and criteria for evaluating CHP projects and evaluating potential. A key issue is that different people disagree about the ways of valuing the different outputs as well as the costs of CHP facilities, and that leads to delay and in some cases barriers to development of CHP projects. So the stakeholder engagement process revealed a need to provide a more uniform approach and set of criteria for evaluating CHP projects. And this, it was determined, would help utilities and developers and potential hosts to focus their efforts on projects that have the best possible potential going forward. So as part of the CHP Action Plan's recommendations, the Department of Commerce suggests establishing an energy savings attribution model as part of Minnesota's technical reference manual. So at this time, I would like to ask Jessica Burdette from Department of Commerce to explain this in a little bit more detail, exactly what the technical reference manual entails, and how the energy savings attribution model factors into it. So Jessica, would you please address this point?
Sure. The technical reference manual is a manual that is developed by the state in collaboration with an advisory committee to establish quantification methods for energy conservation and efficiency measures. So in our TRM, we've got currently approximately 100 measures in place that provide utilities with the algorithms that are required to be used or need to be used to quantify energy savings from projects. And we have vetted those algorithms and have some assurance then that at the very least the energy savings are calculated correctly. We address a number of different issues, not only looking at algorithms for technical reference manual for energy conservation measures, but we also look at other components of measurement and verification and protocols to ensure that eligible technologies are what are being implemented in SIP and that ineligible technologies are weeded out through some evaluation with our advisory committee. So because we have an existing structure around technical engineering type work in SIP, we thought that potentially the stakeholders who participated in the CHP process would be amenable to working on establishing attribution model and evaluation criteria and components of a TRM for CHP within that venue. So it's an interesting way to try and establish some of the criteria. I think where we think there are strengths is that we do have many members of the community in Minnesota engaged in that advisory process, utilities, environmental advocacy, other state agencies, implementers, and trade allies. So we think that it's another good cross-section of stakeholders that can help to vet an attribution model and an evaluation criteria before it becomes an official policy of the Department of Commerce.
Great, thanks very much for that. So we'll move ahead. Actually, I think there's a link to the solicitations that is out there a little later in the presentation. So.
Right, and just real quick, so we're currently in development of the next round of the TRM, the Technical Reference Manual. We have a contract with a third party to update existing measures and add new measures, and so this is a 3-year general process for updating, and we figure if we're looking at CHP through our TRM, given we've just launched the renewal of the TRM, this is an ideal time to include this technology, CHP technology, potentially as a TRM.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next priority issue that was identified is related to evaluation, but it's focusing a bit more on the opportunities themselves around the state. Basically what was pointed out by a number of stakeholders is that it's not well understood where the best potential exists for CHP in the state. And so there's a need for gaining some greater clarity around development opportunities. So suggestions involved studies that could identify and characterize existing sources of waste heat and high-value sites that could be developed, and to focus basically developers and utilities' attention on the sites that have the greatest value and the greatest potential for local communities and customers. The CHP Action Plan then included a recommendation to match to map CHP opportunities specifically at wastewater treatment and other public facilities. And there's actually a state energy program grant from the Department of Energy that was awarded a few months ago, focusing on energy efficiency and biomass potential at municipal wastewater facilities. So Jessica and Adam, could you address this point as well, what that grant is all about and essentially how it dovetails with this identified need through the stakeholder engagement process?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we recognized in our discussions with the stakeholders that there was generally a lot of interest in exploring CHP in public facilities as opposed to looking at large industrial facilities. One of the areas that we found favorable for heading in this direction is the tolerance for longer returns on investment and higher payback periods given the nature of the public facilities. And given that, we decided to, about midway through the stakeholder process, apply for another U.S. DOE grant. And we looked at wastewater treatment and incorporating efficiency and identification of cogeneration in the wastewater treatment sector. We were awarded the grant late 2014 and just started kicking off in January, February of 2015. So we're really just getting started on this and delving into not only cogeneration but also increased efficiency in this one particular segment of wastewater treatment. But we hope that some of the learning that we are able to experience in this grant will help us identify and scope out how to do CHP mapping for public facilities generally. We are currently working with the DOE on another grant application potentially to do CHP mapping in the public facilities, but I don't know if that's going to pan out. But it seemed like one of the recommendations that the stakeholders made is that it would be an appropriate place for the state to continue to explore CHP potential, whether it's technical potential or economic potential, in market segments that may be more favorable to implementing CHP. So right now, you know, we're getting started on the wastewater treatment grant, and we're working with University of Minnesota MnTAP as well as the Pollution Control Agency to identify wastewater operators to work with. We're also working with the University of Illinois ERC that as we go through screening for efficiency projects and we get to the point of getting to a place where we're ready to identify renewable energy projects, University of Illinois will be helping provide those assessments as they come up. So right now we have some pretty modest goals related to what we expect to get out of the wastewater treatment sector. We hope to have 2 detailed assessments for CHP completed, as well as 10 detailed assessments for advanced energy efficiency to be completed. So we hope to gain a little bit more experience and get to a few operators that and help them be able to plan for some of these large capital investment projects through this grant work funded by the U.S. Department of Energy.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So the next priority item focuses on a range of CHP ownership problems and solutions. That's kind of a broad way of putting it. There are a number of different issues involving ownership, from financing through regulatory barriers and uncertainties. Stakeholders identified that there were substantial challenges, for one thing, in terms of finding cost-effective financing for CHP deployment, because CHP projects don't look necessarily like a lot of other types of energy investments, and so it can be difficult to find cost-effective financing for them. The existing incentive programs in the state, many of them omit fossil-fired CHP, and overall state regulation isn't entirely clear about utility ownership of CHP or investment in CHP. So the CHP Action Plan recommendations include a recommendation to leverage existing financing programs that are applicable to CHP to ensure that potential host sites as well as developers and utilities understand the options and the programs and resources that are available, and also to essentially make sure that those programs can be better utilized for CHP projects. So an additional area of priority that was identified involved education and training needs and options around CHP. Basically, there is a substantial lack of knowledge and some lack of competencies and skills, basically skill sets in the market related to CHP development and regulation and financing, as well as even to some degree operation. So the stakeholders identified gaps in knowledge and suggested that resource limitations in this way could be preventing some hosts from studying projects because on the one hand they may not even really know anything about CHP, and in other cases they may know about it but they're not sure how to go about exploring it. So the CHP Action Plan includes recommendations to start with for potentially expanding the Department of Commerce website to provide a central location for a lot of different potential resources that can help communities and potential site hosts and developers and utilities to evaluate CHP opportunities and to make sure that there's access for all of those groups to the information tools and the programs that are available. So finally, a priority that was identified involved adapting the existing conservation improvement programs for supply-side investments. The existing programs really exclude incentives for most CHP projects because the SIP program focuses mostly on demand-side measures to reduce energy use. Additionally, other programs in the state, such as the Renewable Portfolio Standard, omits non-renewable CHP for the most part. And we talked during the stakeholder engagement process about some other ways and venues to try and address the potential incentives or help to facilitate CHP development through an alternative portfolio standard or through integrated resource planning processes at the PUC. And the outcome of the stakeholder engagement process seemed to suggest that while the APS approach could be attractive, it also would require legislation and a pretty significant uphill climb to create an all-new program in the state. And the integrated resource planning process isn't particularly well-suited to CHP projects. So the concept really came out to try and adapt the SIP process, the SIP program in some way that could allow for incentives for development of supply-side investments, especially CHP. And one of the ways that that's been focused on in the CHP Action Plan then through the recommendations is to develop that is electric utility infrastructure measures within the existing Conservation Improvement Program. And the way that the CHP Action Plan recommends going about that is to include EUI measures in the new technical resource manual definitions as part of the Energy Savings Platform Smart Measure Library as part of TRM. So I mentioned earlier that there was an RFP, a solicitation out there, and that's noted here in the green box, focusing specifically on this task of developing electric utility infrastructure measures for use as part of the technical resource manual. So Jessica, would you mind talking a bit further about that?
Yes. So currently in SIP, there is allowance for utilities to claim energy savings from electric utility infrastructure efficiency projects. And as we've talked about in the stakeholder process, potential for utility-owned CHP, there's some question about where that might fit. And if a utility that is improving their own infrastructure and doing it through implementation of a combined heat and power plant project, there may be a way that we can provide the regulatory guidance and certainty that would allow a utility to understand what the impact of that would have on their goals. Currently, for EUI projects in SIP, there are some limitations. Those savings from those EUI projects can only be claimed above the 1% that a utility has already met through traditional demand-side management activities. So the utility, in order to be able to claim that, has to have undertaken significant demand-side management activities before being able to claim that. However, if through the technical reference manual we're able to establish evaluation criteria for CHP projects and how those would be treated from a regulatory standpoint under the eligibility and SIP for EUI efficiency projects, I think that that's where we hope to explore this possibility. We do currently have an RFP out that is soliciting for an engineering firm or whomever to provide engineering algorithms and recommendations for evaluation criteria on electric utility infrastructure efficiency projects. We understand that most of the EUI projects are not going to fit nicely into a simple singular engineering algorithm. However, we do think that for some of the EUI projects that may be more of a one-for-one replacement or maybe a little bit more straightforward, that we can create those TRMs. So we're hoping to explore through this other RFP and this other process what the potential is to include some of those criteria that everyone is going to need to know or that all utilities, electric utilities, are going to need to be aware of if they choose to embark on a utility-owned CHP project that is that they hope to count towards the SIP goal. So that is in progress, and I believe proposals are due Monday, June 1st, and so we'll look forward to crossing that bridge when we come to it.
Thanks, Jessica. So that comes to the end of the priorities that we're focused on in the CHP Action Plan. We'd like to turn the presentation over now to our colleagues at Energy Resource Center. As I mentioned before, they are Stefano, Galiasso, and Graeme Miller. So I'm actually going to hand over control of the presentation right now to Graeme Miller, who I believe is standing by for that control. So bear with me one moment.
Hello, everybody. Michael, I just want to verify that you can see the presentation.
I can see it.
Perfect. So hello, everybody. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Michael, for presenting and for organizing this. I'll kick off the presentation. My name is Graeme Miller. I'm a policy analyst here at the Energy Resource Center. My focus is on utility rate policy and how it affects combined heat and power. And through our center, as you've heard before, we studied how standby rates and net metering policy in Minnesota affect the financial situation of combined heat and power applications in the state. This presentation, I'll be turning it over to my colleague, Stefano Galiasso, and we'll be focusing on how CHP, the calculation methodology for energy savings in Illinois. Stefano's been intimately familiar with the details in Illinois. He sits on the Stakeholder advisory group in Illinois advising how to calculate CHP energy savings. So he is far more the expert than I am. So I'll be turning it over to him right now.
Thanks, Graeme, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot again to Michael and Jessica. I think you've covered a lot of the basics of CHP very well, and hopefully I won't be repeating a lot of what you said, but today what I really wanted to focus on was on what was kind of the winning approach in integrating CHP into the Illinois Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard. It's been a long journey, about 18 months for us. I consider Minnesota is already further ahead in the sense that you have an intention to put the CHP as a measure into the TRM, whereas we were starting a little bit more from scratch, trying to convince stakeholders that CHP was a good measure for an energy efficiency program. Also, I really praise your focus on wastewater because it's a terrific sector that has an amazing opportunity, and the paybacks are really, really, they're not only good, but they're also extremely aligned with what wastewater plants are looking for. So, first of all, I would like to just, please go ahead, and I would like to mention that, you know, this was a story kind of integrating CHP into the Illinois EAPS, and every story really starts with a hero, and our hero, and I would like to pay my dues to John Kadika, who's the former director of the Energy Resources Center. He really had the vision and the commitment to push CHP in Illinois, perhaps going against some of the stakeholders' point of view, and really show how it was an extremely efficient technology and how it was a missed opportunity to not include into the EAPS. So the mission, if you want, the purpose was to include CHP, combined heat and power, and waste heat to power, sometimes referred to as topping cycle and bottoming cycle, into the energy efficiency portfolio standard, so that these measures could be included in Illinois as regular energy efficiency measures, much like you would with replacing a light bulb, for example. So next. So the first question that we needed to answer in Illinois was, can we consider CHP as an efficiency measure? The obvious answer is yes, and it can be found into the statute, which defines an energy efficiency project as a measure that reduces the total BTUs of electricity and natural gas needed to meet the end use consistent with the Power Act. So if we go to the next slide, this is a slide that you may have seen already in different presentations because it comes from DOE, and it's a very quick schematics of how the combined heat and power works in delivering the end use with respect to a traditional system. So the electricity and heat, which you'll see between the arrows, is the end use. And if we look at a traditional system, the power plant will deliver electricity at about 34% efficiency. This is the national average. And a boiler system would be 75% or so efficient. Most of the times it's actually lower than that. But on average, if you take both of them in delivering the end use of certain electricity and certain heat, we can consider them about 50% efficient. On the other side, combined heat and power, which is the on-site generation of both electricity and heat, because of the atmospheric heat losses are actually recovered and used on-site, can be 75% efficient, and actually even more than that. There are some instances where we could hit 80% and perhaps even go beyond 80% overall efficiency. So now we're talking about very significant efficiency gains with respect to the grid and a traditional boiler system. So what I wanted to cover was a little bit of the storyboard. So what happened? What was the process that led to the inclusion of CHP into the Illinois TRM? So first of all, us, the ERC, again, thanks to John, we've proposed a CHP pilot program to DCO. DCO is the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, and is mandated by the Illinois law to administer the public sector and low-income programs. So the goal was to pilot a CHP program for the institutional sector. As you know, DCO was receptive of the idea and then asked ERC to design a pilot program and to bring it to the SAG. So the SAG is the Stakeholder Advisory Group, and it's really the organization where all the stakeholders meet and kind of decide what is the future, if you want, of energy efficiency in Illinois. We received feedback from the SAG, which we then incorporated into our design, and we then submitted a pilot program for approval for a 3-year filing. So every 3 years in Illinois, we have to file the portfolio programs, both for private sector and public sector. And as part of the filing, there are going to be comments from any stakeholder and consultants of stakeholders. And at the end of the filing, CHP was conditionally approved by the ICC, which is the Illinois Commerce Commission, conditionally in the sense that we had proposed a certain approach, but several stakeholders had different opinions and they wanted to have separate considerations, or they wanted to draw different borders around the CHP system. And so ICC said, you know, you can use the approach you proposed until the process, the algorithm is vetted through the formal TRM process. The TRM process started in October 2014, and it was highly debated because there were really different opinions. So what happened was we created a subcommittee specifically for CHP, since several of the parties were not really familiar with how CHP had to be treated, and so they were more confused than actually providing good input. And so the subcommittee was focused on discussing only the CHP-specific issues, which were then solved within another probably 4 to 5 months before CHP was then included finally into the TRM. And you know, we started from a certain position and we ended up to a very different position, which is the one that I'm going to talk about. Next, since we're going to go over a few equations, I wanted to keep the things kind of light. And you know, this is really, it's a really contested measure because different parties will have very different opinions. And so when you're going through the process of including CHP in a TRM, you may want to expect, you know, you should be prepared to expect certain heated discussions. So where did we ended up going? To avoid confusion right now, I really want to focus on the winning approach, so what was actually included in the TRM. And at the end of this presentation, I believe we're going to circulate the work paper, which will include more details, a lot more details, and all the references of where and how the numbers and the algorithms were calculated and were derived from. So the winning approach is based on a CO2 equivalency. What this means is that we're looking at the CO2 intensity of CHP to meet certain end use versus the CO2 intensity of the baseline, which is typically grid, electric grid, and the boiler. And what that means is that the CHP, being natural gas fired, will produce a certain amount of CO2 to produce an effective end use of a certain amount of kilowatt hours and useful therms. Whereas the grid, which tends to have a different mix in a generation mix, which will be heavier on coal, for example, or other more carbon-intensive fuels, is going to have a higher CO2 intensity, meaning that for the same amount of kilowatt hours and therms, it will produce a higher amount of greenhouse gases. So when we take the difference between the two, those are the difference in savings, which we can attribute to the installation of the CHP. So in that sense, it's relatively straightforward when you look at it this way. It's aligned with 111D regulation, which is at least debated, and it's supposed to be adopted in the upcoming months, perhaps years. It's the similar approach that was also proposed into some of the comments to 111D by different parties. So it's not that we created something new from scratch. So we feel very confident with this approach. And it really draws the border of how we're considering the generation of efficient electricity and thermal load kind of at the not even at the state level, but perhaps even at the regional level. So looking at how electricity is delivered to the customers. Yeah, and something I also wanted to say was it's CHP is slightly different from your regular light bulb end use or whatever end use technological improvement, because instead of being completely on, we say, the customer side of the meter, it's going to involve a better generation of the same amount of kilowatt hours. So the savings that you're going to accrue from CHP do not necessarily come from a reduction in electricity consumption, which is most likely going to stay the same. It comes from a reduction in energy that is necessary to produce that electricity. And so how do we claim kilowatt hours, which is energy, after we install CHP? So what is the attribution approach? So first of all, we'll need to calculate the CHP efficiency, which will determine whether or not the CHP, the particular application, is going to qualify for EAPS. The minimum efficiency is 60%. So as we remember from the previous diagram, 50% overall efficiency is achieved by the baseline grid plus boiler, and we're looking for at least 60% from a CHP application on a higher heating value basis to be considered a qualifying measure. And the calculation is relatively simple. You just add up the useful thermal output of the system to the useful electric output of the system, convert the electric output from kilowatt hours to BTUs. Now we have a certain amount of BTUs per year, and then we divide that by the fuel consumption of the CHP system, again in BTUs per year, and that's going to give us the overall efficiency, which basically says that for every unit of energy that we're putting into the system, we get at least 0.6 units of useful output in a combination of electric and thermal. And there's also a sub requirement, I would say, of at least 20% recovered on the thermal side. That really never comes into play because almost always it really has to be at least 20% from the thermal side. Next. So now what we want to do is we want to kind of confirm that, or actually this is something that you can look in your state specifically to see whether a CHP installation is going to be better than the baseline grid plus boiler. And so we're looking at the fuel savings that we're getting from the CHP as the difference between the fuel offset from the grid. So what would the grid consume to produce those kilowatt hours, plus the thermal recover from the CHP, which is actually offset at the grid. So what would the boiler consume in terms of fuel to produce those useful therms? To those, we're going to subtract the, or net out, I would say, the fuel consumption of the CHP. And so when we do this calculation, which has some of the terms that we saw before in the efficiency calculation of the CHP, what we're going to see is if there are net savings that result from the installation of the CHP system. And this is going to be specific on the actual technology, the efficiencies involved, the particular application, everything. So we want to make sure that the installation of a CHP system is going to be more efficient than the baseline. F-grid is, that's the calculation using, shows that we're using the electricity recovered from the CHP system times the heat rate of the grid. Heat rate is the reverse of the efficiency of the grid. So we use eGrid to look at the heat rate values. eGrid provides two different heat rate values, one for marginal and one for baseload. We consider below 6,500 hours marginal and above 6,500 hours baseload, and the two numbers are slightly different, but doesn't really change by too much. Now, after we've determined that the system is actually saving energy with respect to the grid, we can start to look at the attribution of the savings, which is really key, and this is where I believe you're going at with the TRM. So there are three scenarios. This is one of the most popular scenarios where we have we would allocate savings both on the electric side and the gas side. First of all, the reason why we would do this double allocation both on the electric and gas is because we want, well, at least in Illinois there are electric EAPs. There's an electric EAPs program and a natural gas EAPs program, and we want both sides to come into play to ensure that the program will be successful. Because if we have only the electric side to come in and play, then there's not really the same incentive to maximize the CHP efficiency. Whereas if we had only gas, for example, there will not be enough at stake from on the gas side to really make a meaningful impact in the incentives that could be provided to the CHP installation. So what we're looking at is a tier system. There are 3 tiers based on the CHP overall efficiency. Again, higher heating value. And for those that are non-familiar with the heating values, there's 2 potential heating values, a higher heating value and a lower heating value. Typically in US, any efficiency, for example, a boiler, a furnace, anything is expressed in higher heating value. But internationally, CHP prime movers, so when you're buying the actual engine, will be showing lower heating value. And so we need to specify that we're using HHV, and it's a straightforward conversion between the two, but just so everyone knows what numbers we're looking at. So in the column, we'll see that 60% overall efficiency is the baseline to qualify for incentives and claim savings from a CHP installation. And the allocated electric savings on the electric side would be 65% of the production of the CHP system. It's the net production of the CHP system, so anything that the CHP system is producing minus parasitic loads that the CHP would use to run itself. And no gas savings are allocated. Between 60 and 65% system efficiency, CHP system efficiency, now we're getting the same 65% of production of the CHP system, plus we're adding 1 percentage point for every percentage point in efficiency that we're going beyond 65%. Sorry, beyond 60%. So let's say that we have a 63% efficient system. We're going to be able to claim 65 plus 3, 68% of the production of the CHP system. And once again, no gas savings. Now, 65% is going to be the threshold at which gas comes into play. So when we go beyond 65%, the electric savings are capped at 70% of the electricity production of the system, while gas savings will go up as 2.5% of the useful thermal output recovered from the CHP system. For any 1 percentage point above the 65% efficiency of the system. So now we've thrown a lot of numbers out there, and perhaps it'll be good to take a minute to really digest them. But just to summarize, the overall idea is that in any fuel switch scenario, which CHP would be, in the sense that we're moving out of the we're moving out of electricity and getting into natural gas. Typically, it's good to have an incentive from the fuel that we're switching from, and then an additional incentive for additional efficiency to the fuel that we're switching to. So in this sense, we're switching away from electricity, and that's why we're attributing baseline savings to the electric company. And then we're going to attribute additional savings to the gas side, which is the fuel we're switching to, for any point beyond a certain threshold that we've determined. So this is what this table is accomplishing with these three tiers. And then there's two other scenarios. One in which there's only an electric participation. So, for example, the utility territory for gas, maybe some small utility that doesn't participate in EAPs. So in this case, the equations are the same on the electric side that we saw before, just that instead of being capped at 70%, they're going to go up until the max allowed, which is around 85% or so of the savings. And the for systems that are participating in gas-only programs, it's similar to before. The only difference is that instead of starting to participate at 65% efficiency of the system, the gas companies can participate at 60% based on efficiency. This is kind of a borderline scenario that is not really likely to move projects, because there doesn't seem to be a lot enough to play from gas companies to really make a difference. But it's an opportunity, and it may move some projects forward. So just last slide. As I mentioned before, the whole process took over 18 months. It was very contested, several different technical opinions, and it really depends on which point of view one is looking at. And the one we ended up choosing is really the point of view of, overall, is Illinois better or worse off from an installation of a CHP system in a specific location? Some of the lessons learned: it's very important to involve every stakeholder from the beginning. Utilities will have very different point of views. At least in Illinois, there's a lot of other firms and consultants that had different point of views, and so we didn't want to surprise anybody with a certain conclusion. We wanted to have everyone participate into discussions. And then, remember that there's many details to discuss, and some of them can be difficult for non-engineers. So you don't want to have those details fall through the cracks, because really the devil is in the details, and it's very important to make sure that everyone understands what's happening. Yeah, this is really it, and we're going to share the work paper, right, Graeme?
Yes. So, Michael, that's the end of our presentation. I'm going to throw it back to you.
Okay, standing by. Okay, I think we're back live. Okay, good. Looks like we're back. Thanks very much, Stefano, for that presentation. That's helpful. So at this point, we have time for some questions and answers. A couple of questions have come through already, and I think they follow on directly from the Energy Resources Center presentation. So I think we will address a couple of those first, and then we'll move on to a few other questions that have come up. I'd like to reiterate that here we are addressing, with regard to the CHP Action Plan and stakeholder engagement process, we're mostly addressing general questions about it as well as the process itself. More detailed questions and comments on the content of the CHP Action Plan and the recommendations therein should be directed to the Department of Commerce through the comment period process. And on this screen, you'll see the email address to submit those comments. But so looking at a couple of questions that have come through, one point involves the higher heating value versus lower heating value algorithm. The question is, why did Illinois select HHV instead of LHV, and how would using LHV affect the algorithm savings differently? So Stefano, can you address that question?
Yes, of course. It's a good question. The short answer is that nothing really would change. We would just need to pick different efficiency numbers. The relationship between higher heating value and lower heating value is a difference of about 10% between the two. And it relates to the fact that we may or may not include the heat content of water vapor in the calculations. So if you were to choose lower heating value, the efficiency values would look artificially higher. So you will want to use a baseline of, for example, 65% lower heating value instead of 60% higher heating value, which are extremely, very comparable, pretty much the same.
Okay, thank you. One other question, Stefano, and I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I'll try to relate it. I'll just read it, the full thing, and you may have covered some of it after the question was posted, but I think it does raise an interesting question. Under the Illinois system, if a customer with a CHP system installed additional electric demand-side management measures, how would those savings be treated? Could the electric utility claim savings if they're not actually generating the electricity reduced? Or, for that matter, could the gas utility serving the CHP system claim those savings, since presumably less gas would be used? Or would those savings be ignored? So in other words, how is your program, how is your approach treating other DSM measures installed at sites where there's CHP in place?
Right, that's another very good question. So there's a specific rule in Illinois that prohibits exporting net export of electricity produced from a CHP system. So what happens is that in the case of, say, a facility puts in a CHP system and it covers, say, 80% of their load, they may be exporting some energy at certain times in the year, but they cannot net export overall, otherwise they won't qualify. So they're still connected to the grid, or interconnected to the grid, and they're still using grid electricity. Now, if they start to implement additional energy efficiency and it impacts the operation of the CHP system, it's very important to note that then this is going against the savings of the CHP system itself. But if the additional energy efficiency is going to impact the baseline, that and therefore instead of using, say, 80% of CHP-generated electricity and 20% of grid-generated electricity, the facility moves to, in an extreme case, 100% CHP-generated electricity, then those savings would be claimed by the electric utility. If the additional DSM were to reduce the consumption of the CHP system, the run hours of the CHP system, this is affecting the overall savings of the CHP system. So one would have to look at kind of what's happening on site. Do we see a reduction in gas consumption for that sense? And then it's perhaps a gas measure, maybe are we going below the efficiency that that qualifies the CHP system, and then it doesn't qualify anymore? And then another question is, are you looking at lifetime savings or first-year savings? If you're looking at first-year savings and DSM happens in the future, then there's a new baseline to look upon, and it's kind of easier to decide whether or not those are electric or gas savings. If you're looking at lifetime savings, then there's going to be kind of dual baseline. So there's going to be a certain baseline for a certain number of years, and then a different baseline in the years afterwards. So that could be a little bit more complicated. So I know I didn't give a straight answer, but I guess one would have to look at the specific implications of the project on a project-by-project basis.
Okay, thank you. One more question, Stefano. Could you clarify the phase that the initiative is at? In other words, has it actually yielded projects at this point? But the specific question is, how many CHP projects have been implemented in Illinois through the allocation process?
Right. So if I understand the question, so how many CHP projects were installed because of the program?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So I don't know how much we can disclose of this, but the RFP, so the DCO decided to do an RFP, which was due sometime in November of last year, and the selection went on for another couple of months, and this is really the beginning of the 3 years, or actually two and a half years or so that CHP systems are eligible. And I don't know if they already made public announcements, but we've received a surprisingly high number of applications into the RFP, totaling about 30 megawatts, and several. Without going over details, but several wastewater plants. The words are public. Yeah. So if I think they ended up, because of funding issues, in the sense that there aren't funds available to fund everybody. Five CHP systems will be installed for. Just doing the math in my mind, perhaps like 15 or so megawatts. Some of them were deemed to be simply too early in the process, and they may not be able to fully install the systems in the 2 years left. Some of them were not we're not making the meeting economic criteria necessary in Illinois. But we received at least 3 times more applications. So there was a lot of interest with a very short turnaround time, I would say, because these projects really take a lot of time to design and implement. And for decision makers, it really takes a lot of time to understand and approve such a project. So we were very surprised.
And Michael, I'd like to add that that's for the public sector program only. So those 5 sites that are moving forward are only in the public sector. The private sector, the private utilities haven't released their CHP incentives yet, but because the methodology has been approved by the SAG, utilities can now go forward with CHP programs if they choose to.
Yeah, and I think in the Illinois TRM, which is right now a public document, and you can access that. It's still not approved by the ICC, but it would be effective June 1st of this year. So within a month or so, it should receive approval, and from then on, anyone can come into private utilities and bring in a CHP project.
Okay, great. Thanks, gentlemen. That's a good answer. I appreciate it. So we have time for just a couple of more questions, and one of them that was posted early I want to get to. The question is, with regard to the Minnesota potential that's been identified, is that economic potential evenly distributed throughout the state, or does it tend to be located in specific geographies? Well, part of the mapping initiative is intended to help clarify that, but some work already has been done to help show really where CHP potential is in the state. So I'm going to bring into view here a website. Actually, this is a PDF displayed on the Minnesota Department of Commerce website, which you can see here in this other tab. This is the Combined Heat and Power Stakeholder Meetings website. And if you look at these first items here under Reports and Resources, the FVB Energy reports address some of these topics. One of them is open here. It's actually the second one on that list, focusing on regulatory issues, but the information is taken out of the potential report. You can see from these data that indeed CHP potential is not evenly distributed throughout the state. Really, in terms of utility service territory, the lion's share of it is in Northern States Power, Xcel Energy's territory, with Minnesota Power also substantial, but substantially less than than Xcel, and the other utilities in the state much less even than that. So you can see, at least from a service territory point of view, that it is not evenly distributed. And that also is true with regard to distribution among different industry sectors. The largest industry sector is, and sectors for CHP potential include industrial sites, with others substantially smaller, at least in terms of megawatts of capacity. So to reiterate, you can find this information at the Commerce website dedicated to this process. It's a little hard to find, actually. You can Google it and find it pretty easily. Otherwise, if you go to Microgrid Institute's page, you will find that resources on this topic are right now displayed in our current work section on our homepage. And also, if you click the Resources tab, you'll see that a lot more resources are broken out there. So that's one easy way to navigate to some of this information. So back to the Q&A, there was one other that I wanted to bring up, and this is a question for Jessica involving the process going forward. And that question is, do you anticipate a CHP subcommittee being formed within the TRM advisory group? Can you address that question, Jessica?
Sure. I don't think we are that far in the planning process. We still have quite a few efforts that we want to run through our TRM process, including the electric utility infrastructure efficiency, as well as discussions around codes and standards. So I would imagine, as we have had subgroups in our TRM advisory group before to look at specific technologies, like, for instance, hot water heating technology or water heating technologies, I could see us continuing that pattern and having a specific subcommittee for evaluating CHP as part of the technical reference manual. But at this point, we're a little, for me to say definitively, it's a little early yet.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Jessica. That's helpful. Well, with that, I think we have run out of time. And so I just wanted to hit the final two slides in our presentation. First, to identify the next steps in the CHP Action Plan process. As I've mentioned before, there's a public comment period open right now, and comments are invited through May 15th. And you can submit those to sip.contact@state.mn.us. The CHP Action Plan is expected to be finalized in June, and we will be convening another webinar to review that final action plan at that time. And finally, the final slide is just providing some online resources. We'll leave this up for a little while so that any attendees can refer to these. But finally, I just want to thank all the participants in this webinar today, including Jessica and Adam, as well as Graeme and Stefano, and also Peter Douglas at Microgrid Institute. We thank you for participating and also thank all of the attendees for joining us today. Thanks very much, and we will stay in touch. Have a good afternoon.